It was wonderful being back in person with all of you last week. I really enjoyed that. I especially enjoyed sitting in the circle and singing with you because, of course, that's challenging on Zoom. But it occurred to me that there are some things that Zoom does even better than being in person, and one of those is sharing pictures. So that's the origin of how we got to today's message, which is really a picture show. Um, it, we're going to talk about sacred spaces and how the spaces that people inhabit and gather in for worship, whatever the tradition is, um, come to embody what they hold to be important. And so they're different depending on where they are and what their local legends are, local um, the memories that they want to hold on to. This passage from Exodus that I read, um, it, it I did an imaginative, okay, now you've built this thing. What do you think is going to happen next with this portable tabernacle that they've built out in the desert? And I just had this marvelous image of they get this whole thing built and somebody shows up with the shofar, the big horn, that they blow at Rosh Hashanah, and says, I've been keeping this thing in my tent, but it doesn't really belong to me. It's a holy object. I think we should store it in the tabernacle. And so they find a corner and they put the shofar there. And later on this journey, when they do the people rebel against Moses and the Lord, and God sends all these poisonous snakes and bites all the people, and they whine to Moses. And God says, make a bronze serpent on a pole and let the people stare at it, and they will be cured of their snake bites, which he did. But then, when they get all done with that episode, you've got this great bronze serpent on a pole, right? And it's the memory of that experience. Like, man, we don't want to do that again. We should remember we tried it once. It was a bad idea. Let's hold on to the bronze serpent on a pole. And that ends up in the tabernacle too, because it doesn't really belong to any one person. It's the experience of the whole tribe of Israelites. This is how sacred spaces come to be furnished. They acquire their objects like physical diaries, their memories of things that they have shared, of people that they've loved who are no longer with them. It's like having a living archive, and that's why their churches are different from one church to another, and yet they are recognizable. So I'm going to give you a little travel quiz here. Can I have the first slide?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Should I do the slides? Yes. One moment,
Yeah,
please.
you go.
It's
If you walked into a Catholic church and saw this icon, what country would you be in? You can unmute yourself and answer.
Mexico.
Mexico. Good job. This is the Virgin of Guadalupe, right? She's local to Mexico. The vision of Mary to the indigenous Mexican Indian Juan Diego, speaking his language in a particular place in Mexico, that's their story, and she is their icon. And you won't find her other places in the world unless it's a Hispanic community like in the southern U.S. that emigrated and brought her with them. She's a very local icon. Here's another example. What country are we in with this icon? Anybody recognize that?
That's Our Lady of Perpetual Help.
Maybe. What country are we in? This is a very specific icon.
Yeah, I'm not recognizing the country.
We're in Poland. This is the Black Madonna of Czestochowa, who is, I actually don't know the history of her presence in Poland, but she's very specific to the Polish people. every year, 1 million or so of them make a pilgrimage to the monastery at Jasnogoro, where this icon lives. Um, she's a point of solidarity for the Polish people. Lech Walesa used to wear a lapel pin with this image on it because it spoke so strongly to his efforts to encourage solidarity in Poland. And outside of Poland, you probably won't see this particular rendition of the Madonna. Okay, next one is a little trickier. Who is the woman in this stained glass window? She's wearing red, not blue or white. She has red hair, and she's present at the crucifixion.
Mary Magdalene.
Oh, good job, Sammy. Yes. And so, therefore, what country are we probably in?
France.
France, that's right. That's right. In fact, this stained glass window is at Chartres, the big cathedral there. France carries still the legend. I call it a legend because I don't know whether to call it history or not. From the point of view of the French people, it is history, but the rest of us aren't sure, so we call it a legend. That Mary Magdalene, after Jesus' death, left Jerusalem, that much makes sense, and eventually ended up on a boat sailing across the Mediterranean and landed in southern France and spent the rest of her life in France preaching and teaching. That legend is alive all over France, so that if you know where to look and what you're looking for, you will find you will find her all over the place. It helps to know that the French version of Magdalene is Madeleine. So the Church of the Madeleine in Paris there's a reason that she's her sculpture is on the high altar. She's almost always wearing red, and her iconic objects are the alabaster jar, a book, and a skull. If you happen to be in southern France and Provence, you can visit the church at St. Maximine Saint-Abaun that has her relics, including her skull and a golden reliquary. Some of her bones are actually at the Abbey Church in Vézelay up in Burgundy. Relics were a big deal in the Middle Ages, and it's partly because pilgrims would come to see them and be in their presence, and pilgrims coming into a little town were good for the local economy. And so when a famous holy person died, like Mary Magdalene, churches used to have polite little tussles over who gets their bones, and Mary Magdalene's ended up in more than one place. If you happen to be in Provence in July, you can go down to the little town of Saintes Marie de la Mer, where they celebrate every July. There's a big festival celebrating the landing of Mary Magdalene and the other Marys. That's why it's Saintes Marie. There are three of them, Mary Jacobi and Mary Salome. And Sarah came with them. Sarah, who was either, depending on which legend you listen to, either Mary Magdalene's Egyptian handmaiden or her daughter by Jesus. And in any case, Sarah is the patron saint of the Romany people, the gypsies in southern France. So it's a huge festival every year, a very big deal. Mary Magdalene belongs to France, and they are happy to claim her. And in spite of the fact that Pope Gregory mislabeled her a prostitute 1,500 years ago, they're not really very worried about that. If you get to Paris and happen to visit the church called Saint Severin, next slide please, you will find Mary Magdalene in 13th century stained glass. There she is in red, landing with the other Marys on either side of her and the boat in the background. And the words underneath her read, Apostolat en Provence, the apostleship of St. Mary Magdalene in Provence. If you make it over to the big church at San Sulpice, next slide, you'll want to be sure to check out the Pietà that was done in kind of the mid 1800s. It's in this really dimly lit chapel, so you have to make an effort to get up close. Next slide. But when you do, it's quite a remarkable statue. This is the Virgin Mary holding Jesus and Mary Magdalene, who has her hand in Jesus' hand, and their hair is intermingled, and the Virgin Mary is embracing both of them. And it makes a statement. The artist is trying to tell you something about Mary Magdalene's relationship in this family. So the French are very clear how they feel about Mary Magdalene, in spite of what the church might say or what the rest of the world thinks. France as a country has the political boundaries that we are accustomed to, but it's really an amalgam of some different cultural groups which cross political boundaries. So in the very south of France, over in the Languedoc, you find the Catalan people who are really connected to the other Catalan people who are in Spain, in northeastern Spain. That's a cultural grouping which is still alive and celebrated, and the language is spoken. Up in the northwestern part of France is Brittany. Brittany is one of the 7 Celtic nations, and they still speak their own language there. They speak Breton, and they keep alive the Celtic legends. One of the ones that has really survived with time is the group of legends around Arthur, King Arthur. We think of it in terms of the about 1,000-year-old work by Chrétien Troyes that tells the Arthur legend of the sword and the stone and all of that. But there were Arthur legends in the Celtic nations before that. There's Arthur in legends in Scotland, and of course in Cornwall, and there are Arthur legends in Brittany, in France. The legends that have survived in France excuse me, center on the forest of Brocéliande, where Merlin and Morgan Le Fay are remembered. It's the kind of the magical part of the whole story. In that forest is the Valley of No Return, where Morgan Le Fay lured faithless knights and then magically altered the pathways so they never managed to find their way out again. Near the entrance to the valley, you can do the next slide, Peter, thank you. Near the entrance to that valley and the huge forest is a tiny town called Trehorantoik. And in that town is a little church, tiny Catholic church. I mean, the whole town doesn't even have 200 people in it. But this church is rather unusual. From the outside, it looks pretty ordinary. But if you were to visit today, you would see out in front a life-size bronze statue. Next slide. This is Abbé Henri Gillard, who was the priest here from 1942 to 1962. He's the one responsible for the church's being unusual. This abbé must have been a bit of a rebel, because he ran afoul of his local bishop, and whatever he did, as penance, he was assigned to the smallest church in the smallest town in the whole district that this bishop was in charge of. So when he arrived in Trehorantoik in 1942, he found a 16th century church half in ruins, having been built on that site to honor a local 7th century saint, Saint Onen, who's buried there. The town had no funds to improve the situation, but I think the bishop had kind of underestimated Abbe Gillard because the good fathers took on an extra job to raise money, and he set about remodeling the church. And in the remodeling, he decided to honor all the local legends. And for these folks, because of their location, their big local legend is this forest of Broceliande, which is like right down the street, and the Arthur legends that are part of that. Before long, the church became known as l'Église du Graal, the Church of the Holy Grail, the Grail being the quest of the Knights of the Round Table. So when I was in Brittany a few years ago, and we stopped to see this church, I had an interesting experience. As I was walking up to the front door, a little French woman came storming out of the door right past me, and she's beside herself. She's muttering under her breath, "Heresy, heresy." Heresy, okay. There must be something really interesting in here. All right. I paused long enough to read the letters that Father Gillard had mounted over the front door. We see the next slide. It says, "La porte est en dedans." The door is within. The door is within. And of course, immediately you would ask yourself, within what? Within the church? Within me? This guy, there's already, I'm intrigued, right? This is not kind of standard. However, when you walk in and you turn right and look up the length of the church, next slide, it all looks, pretty ordinary. It's a terrible picture, but I just want you to get the idea. It's a, perfectly normal little country Catholic church, right? Some stained glass, some pictures on the wall, and the statues up in front are Saint Onnen and her brother, Saint Eudokia. Everything looks fine. So I'm walking down the aisle toward the altar, and on one side there's a stained glass window that looks like this. Next slide. There's Jesus at the Last Supper, and on the table in front of his disciples is the Holy Grail, right? The cup that he used at the Last Supper. The only thing is, this is one of two stained glass windows, same size, parallel, and the other one looks like this. Oh, this is King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, also sitting around a table. And now the Holy Grail is up here being held by angels in a vision, because finding the Holy Grail is the quest of the Knights of the Round Table. It's just that in a church setting, to put these two stories right next to each other, or facing each other as they were, those windows across the church, that's a really interesting identification. Okay, Jesus and the disciples and the Grail, and here we have Arthur and his knights going after the Grail. Okay, all right. So I could see the French woman getting a little agitated, but we could survive this. And I keep walking up the aisle, and I get to the altar, and on the floor in front of the altar is more Grail imagery, which is all through this church. Next slide. There's a mosaic on the floor right in front of the altar that says, "La puissance du sang divin," the strength, the power of the divine blood. Because, of course, the Grail, according to legend, was also the cup that Joseph of Arimathea used to catch the drops of Jesus' blood on the cross. And the symbol behind the Grail, the Jerusalem cross, the even-armed cross, and the 4 other crosses in the quadrant, that emblem is what the Crusaders wore. Now, the Crusaders are like the Knights of the Round Table kind of in real life. They were headed off to recover the Holy Land from the infidels, right? The Saracens. And oh, by the way, as long as you're recovering the entire land, you might as well bring back the objects, the holy objects, which presumably are still there, including the Grail. So now we've incorporated the Crusades, and elsewhere in the church there is Templar imagery. And the Knights Templar, were the group that started as a small private army to protect the pilgrims going to the Holy Land, and ended up being kind of like a bank and way too powerful, and so the king had to, annihilate them all. But a few of them escaped, and as the legend goes, took the Templar treasure, which may or may not have included the Holy Grail, maybe to Scotland, to Rosslyn Chapel, which is another place that's all full of coded messages. These stories just, they go on and on. So there's Templar imagery and Scotland imagery in the stained glass windows at Tre Horentoik. There are paintings in this church too, courtesy of a German prisoner of war. So this is like we're at the end of the waning years of World War II. Abbe Gillard managed to borrow this prisoner from the German POW camp because he was a painter and he needed someone who could paint some pictures for his church. He borrowed a carpenter too, who built the altar and the pews and so forth. The Abbe must have been a really interesting guy. Anyway, here's one of the paintings that's up near the altar at the front of the church. Yeah, okay. The woman in hot pink is Morgan Le Fay confronting a knight. And you can see Merlin resting off here to the left and the little church at Tre Horentoik. And these rocks symbolize the Valley of No Return. And we have, this picture has a lot in it. But mostly you should notice Morgan because she's the local, I wouldn't say holy person, but certainly a local personage of some renown. She shows up again. See, the other thing this painter contributed was the Stations of the Cross, the 14 pictures that depict Christ moving along the Via Dolorosa and through the crucifixion. And in Station 9, next slide please, which is entitled Christ Falls for the Third Time, look at the setting of this. Here's Morgan Le Fay and the Valley of No Return in the background. And don't ask me what flight of imagination caused them to place her in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. But all through this church, there are efforts to draw parallels between Jerusalem and Tre Horentoik, which are just fascinating. So, I could see the little French woman looking at this picture going, just starting to kind of just get a little annoyed. And finally, we turn around and we look down the length of the church to the back wall. The whole back wall, all the way up to the ceiling, is taken up by a mural. Next slide, please. The mural has on it a white stag wearing a cross and with a halo, surrounded by 4, they're supposed to be lions, although they look more like wolves to me, but 4 lions also with halos, and a forest in the background, and a river, and a columbine, which is emblematic of the Holy Spirit, and an unidentified red thing, which people sometimes call the Philosopher's Stone. Okay, so what does this represent? Well, given that it's in a church, the stag is almost surely Christ, surrounded by the four evangelists. So on one level, that kind of works. We've got the white stag, the pure, chaste, etc. On the other hand, in the Celtic world, the white stag is hugely symbolic, connected to, among other things, the pre-Christian god Cernunnos, who was the lord of the wild things, the horned one, who lived in the forest, was the god of fertility, and it was so popular that when Christianity moved into this area, they really had to make an effort to stamp out the cult of Cernunnos because, well, let's just say the attitudes were a little different. They basically labeled him the Antichrist. Okay, I think this mural is probably what set off the little French lady, because she probably knew exactly all the implications of putting a cross on a white stag in this mural. It's just amazing. Whatever your thoughts are about Abbe Gillard and all the different things he's trying to meld into this church, you have to admit he did a good deed for this tiny little town. I mean, they've got, as I said, fewer than 200 people, and they get about 50,000 visitors a year, which it totally sustains the local economy. It's just like having relics in your church. People come to see this stuff. So he's set up his little church in perpetuity, and they're doing just fine. So, sacred spaces and their furnishings. As we come back into our sacred space in different ways and different timing, but over the summer, it's lovely to look around and think about what we have decided to keep and the stories that the objects tell and what it says about us and our experiences together and the people that we want to remember. We get to reclaim our story coming back into our space.